This is GovExec Daily, where we bring you the federal stories that really matter. It's March 30th, 2022. I'm Ross John Fortuné. The most recent Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, with the United States and its NATO allies sanctioning Russian financial assets. Russian President Vladimir Putin has had harsh words for the U.S. since, and has been a thorn in the side of American cybersecurity for years. In response to the threat of Russian cyber incursions, President Joe Biden put out a statement earlier this month urging agencies and organizations in the private sector to be vigilant about their cyber hygiene and defense. Biden noted Russia's recent history of attacks on critical infrastructure systems as reason to encourage increased attentiveness to cybersecurity. Our guest today recently published a blog on Cisco's website about the ways that organizations should protect themselves, including implementing multi-factor authentication and building more for resiliency. Peter Romness is a Cybersecurity Principal in the Public Sector CTO Office at Cisco Systems Inc. After a short break, he'll join me to discuss cyber defense in light of increased fears about cyber attacks.
GmarkU, a collaborative community-based platform for knowledge sharing and skills development. Bringing you together at cutting-edge, highly interactive events, including our premier conference, GAIN. Grow, accelerate, innovate, and network. Join the marketplace of knowledge. Learn, connect, insights at gmarku.com.
With American support for Ukraine in its war against Russia as the backdrop, President Biden has recently warned of increased potential of cyber attacks on critical infrastructure in the U.S. The White House put out a statement renewing its calls for all organizations, including its partners in the private sector, to bolster their cyber defenses, writing that Russia, quote, could conduct malicious cyber activity against the United States. Peter Romness is a cybersecurity principal in the Public Sector CTO Office at Cisco Systems Inc. He joins me now to discuss cyber defense in light of increased fears about attacks. Welcome to the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So I guess broad view, what is the threat and what should people be worried about?
Well, normally when we talk about cybersecurity and what you hear about in the news, it's almost always financial threat. The fear of ransom, fear of somebody or stealing, somehow stealing money. This is a little bit different because it's the idea that because of the war going on, the Russian government has the ability to act on our physical systems, things like our electric grid, our sewer systems, our water supply, and the ability to alter how they work or to shut them down, which of course could have effect of actually costing people's lives. So it's a little bit different. And it's something that many in the industry have been talking about in the past, but now it's being brought more to the general public's attention.
So to that point, how can organizations sort of identify if they're vulnerable to these threats from Russia, from just any dangerous actor?
Yeah, well, it is the warning from the White House basically says that all organizations should be looking for threats and being more vigilant. We do talk about the physical threat, but, with the Colonial Pipeline shut down about 6 months ago, they did not shut down the pipeline. They shut down the business systems that allowed the pipeline company to bill for their oil that was being transferred through the pipeline. And so it had the same effect as shutting down the pipeline because they had to have that capability to do that. So really, everybody is vulnerable. And if you're not already doing something about it, then you're probably particularly vulnerable. And if you are doing something about it, you need to, be having your good cyber hygiene, and being extra vigilant, as the statement from the White House says. At Cisco, we're helping protect part of the infrastructure and part of the systems in some of these affected areas in the world. And we're seeing a lot of what is happening overseas, and we're applying that to what's going on in the United States. And even we are being more vigilant. So in places where we know where things are a little bit hotter, we're being a little more aggressive in, say, quarantining certain files that we may have in the past said were suspect, but instead in these areas we're being a little more cautious and the guard is up a little higher.
Let's sort of talk about the ways that we can be more guarded. Multi-factor authentication is something that you wrote about on Cisco blog recently. It's increasingly important. I know my text message app on my phone is full of these sort of things. How important is multi-factor authentication, and how can it protect against these kind of threats?
So, and I love the way you asked that question, because people talk about multi-factor authentication, why it's important. They talk about you need it. They don't talk about why it's important. And the reason it's important is because it makes sure that the person who has the account name and user password is the person that it's supposed to be. And the most common way for bad actors to get into systems is to impersonate somebody else, to use different passwords, and then to use those passwords to gain access to what a person can have. So if I'm going to log into a place and I have a username and password, multi-factor authentication then me to have something else that's me. And it's important, it works well. So Jen Easterly, who is the director of CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure and Security Agency, part of DHS, about a month ago, off the cuff, she said that 99% of threats could be taken care of if people use multi-factor authentication. And while this was an off-the-cuff comment, and it probably is not quite 99%, it is in the upper 90s of how effective multi-factor can be. And in fact, we've seen malware that looks for multi-factor authentication, and if it sees it, it doesn't activate. And so it is very effective. And so if somebody is, wants to really make sure that is the person they say they are, and it is the person that I want to have access to the different parts of my organization, then multi-factor authentication is very effective, and it can be very easy to implement. Multi-factor authentication got a really bad name in the early days because we all had to carry around these little fobs that would produce random numbers. And when we wanted to, log into something and we were in a hurry, we'd have to have that thing and type in those numbers. Now it's much easier. It sends a push to my phone where I click a green check if it's me, and that's my second factor, and it gets me in. So, one, it shows me that my organization has this layer of security, and two, it's not that hard.
Yeah, I joke about the string of text messages, but it's certainly very effective, and I think
yeah.
I think as you note, it is one layer that's pretty easy to deal with, and I think is increasingly becoming just standard within the sort of technological reality of our world. Let's sort of talk about another part of that, and the sort of increasing reality of the cloud. Many organizations keep their assets in the cloud. In fact, I was just talking with a coworker today about getting a new laptop and how much was in the cloud versus on his machine, that kind of thing. How vulnerable is the cloud sort of broadly, and what should organizations look for within its cloud policy?
Well, long time organizations have been very hesitant to lose control and lose the idea that they hold their data and their applications in their environment, and so it's the safest for it. And what I would argue is that most likely putting something in the cloud is more secure than if it was being managed by you and your small security. Vendors spend a lot of time. They are focused on what they do, and they probably have a much bigger security staff and the ability to invest in security tools. Much better ability to do that than the average organization trying to provide security for their own users. So in almost all cases that I've seen, putting your applications and data in the cloud is as safe or safer than what you can do on site. Now, there are some things that you do need to do. Communications to and from the cloud should be encrypted. But you also have to protect what I call the on-ramp to the cloud. If people in a branch office or maybe a small office and they're connecting to your Wi-Fi, and then that Wi-Fi, then they connect from there to the cloud, you have to protect that area that's in your purview. If it's just a user with a laptop, well, then you need to protect that user and laptop as they are connecting to the cloud. And so that means that you have to put the protection in those areas and put ways of being able to control the security and see what's going on in that small environment that's part of your bigger overall and general environment. So, it's the idea of putting the security where the user is, making sure it's encrypted, and then getting the data and applications and cloud working for you. The other advantage of the cloud is that it's oftentimes easier to manage, it's easier to implement, and it's easier to scale. So there's a lot of advantages to going to the cloud. I would say that, this idea of cloud first is probably not the best idea, but cloud smart is the best idea. And of course, the government's gone that way too. But, you may find that there are certain applications you do want to keep in-house, either because you want to control them more, or because they're very mature, you know what the costs are, and you can probably actually maybe save some money by doing it. So, you need to look at all these things, but, cloud should definitely be part of your arsenal.
We'll sort of end on this, start to talk about individual responsibility, such as it were. Any cyber defense is only as good as its least prepared employee within any organization. So how can companies, government agencies, that kind of thing, how can they get their people on board with digital security, and how do they sort of keep up with best practices?
Well, I'm sure you've heard people talk about that the user is the weakest link in security. And that can be true, but I tend to call that blame the user. And even the most sophisticated user that's been through all of the training can be fooled. So do we need to train our users? Yes, I think we need to bring everybody in an organization into the idea that security is part of the things we do, and they all need to know why it's important. But the threats have gotten too tough for the user. And so we have to have the technology and the processes behind it to make sure that if something happens, that we can first off detect it. So can we see abnormal behavior in our environment? Can we see devices accessing things or trying to access things that we know they shouldn't? Can we see the threats in the environment? And then can we take action to respond to them? And so I see that the technology and process is in place behind the user to make sure that they're safe. Now, another thing about the user is that I feel that you have to bring the whole organization along. So it's almost like doing internal public relations or internal advertising to make sure that the users are part of the solution. And it's a continuous thing. And it needs to come top down from the highest people organization that security is important. Why? And things like a multi-factor authentication where the user really sees that you're improving their life by making it easy and making their capabilities secure. I think that helps a lot.
Well, hopefully our audience can heed that and sort of stay safe in the digital world going forward. Peter, thanks so much for being on the show with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to GovExec Daily. Our show is produced by Adam Butler and hosted by me, Ross John Fortune. We want to thank Cisco's Peter Romness for joining the program. Our music is the song Signals by Catfish Dancing. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Google Podcasts or anywhere else you get your podcasts. Check us out on the Clubhouse app by searching for GovExec Daily. You can email us any feedback at podcast@govexec.com or hit us up on Twitter @govexec. We'd love to hear from you. We'll talk to you later.